Welcome into the Nutmeg Tavern. We are live today. We're even ahead of schedule. Isn't this great? We've got the nutmeg here, and it is nice and full of aroma. And it is Friday, and it's time for us to talk about fun 18th century stuff. I'm your host, John Townsend, and I have other folks that are helping me here today. Lauren is in the chat.
Hello, everybody.
And Ivy is on the console.
Hi, everyone.
And a special thanks to last week when Ryan was on the console, and we had Rory Groves in the live stream. That's still up, right? So if people want to check that out, they can check that out.
Yes.
Did a great job talking about community and what's happening today versus the 18th century and fun stuff like that. But today we're going to be talking about orchards and specifically apple trees, but orchards in general, how they're different from how we think about orchards today, how important they were for individuals and homesteads and farms, and how they were really an integral part, and they're very, very different from orchards that are today. But before we jump into that, do we need to say anything to anybody
I think
specific?
we're good. We'll touch on some things later in as more people come in.
Orchards, again, really important. If you have a small farm in North America in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, an orchard's going to be just an integral part of what's going on in your farm. So you have livestock, you have field crops, you've got farm garden areas, you have an orchard, you've got all these things that are kind of like building blocks. Today when we have a farm, a lot of farmers, they just do one thing. It's like, I grow corn and soybeans, or I just have livestock, or whatever it is. That's not what's happening in the 18th century. Each farm is like its own community, and it has all these different components because you need, if you have livestock, then you probably should have an orchard. One of the things that orchards are used for in the 18th century is for feeding livestock. It's one of the major components. We never think about that today. We don't think, well, I'm going to feed my cows or horses with my orchard, but that's part of what's happening in the 18th century. And there was even one reference, I think it's in Peter Kalm, where he's talking about how the poultry roost in the orchard. That's just like, well, we don't really have a chicken house. We have a spot where the chickens naturally roost in the orchard. That's the place where they want to go. Maybe because, the trees are a certain kind and shape. It's easy for them to get into. Maybe because there are bugs there that they can eat, or just all kinds of interesting interconnected parts of an orchard. And one of the most fascinating things to understand about those kinds of farm orchards is that apples tended to be a very different, and orchards aren't just apples, but apples are kind of the major fruit coming out of orchards, that apples aren't like most of the apples today. Apples tended to be not something that you ate off of a tree, unless you were somebody like kids would do that or something. But apples as fruit on a table, fairly less, let's just say, a lot less popular. Today we have apples that are specifically made to eat out of the bag. Let's eat an apple as a snack. Not necessarily a thing that's very common in the 18th century at all. If they're going to use apples for regular human food, for culinary purposes, they were usually stewed, they were baked into puddings and things like that. And we've done a couple of different, like 3-4 different apple pies on the channel, and they're very different from apple pies today. But their apples definitely weren't necessarily as sweet. They certainly weren't bred up the same way. And one of the interesting things about these farm orchards is they weren't grown from what would we call it? They were grown from seed instead of from seedlings or grafted trees. And you never kind of knew what apples you were going to get from a seeded apple tree, because they don't tend to give you exactly the same kind of apple as what it came from. So, the tree has an apple and then you plant those seeds and you're going to get something completely different. It's like you're getting the root stock or of something that isn't necessarily made for a wonderful kind of fruit. But for these farmers in the 18th century, that was advantageous in some ways. That means that you had all these different kinds of apples. They might ripen sooner. Some of them might be sweeter or whatever, but you just kind of never knew what you were going to get. You just plant these seeds and you got a bunch of crazy wild apple trees. And they tended to be much taller, and the fruit was, little, who knows what you're going to get. But the trees were used for animal food, and they were used for cider specifically, and a lot less for food. And because the apple trees were all sorts of different kinds of apples, they would be harvestable at different times. So your harvest time was stretched out. Instead of having a 2-week time period where all your apples are ready to take care of, you got to do something with them, you would have like 6 weeks or 8 weeks of, well, you've got early apples, you've got late apples, and the different kinds of flavors of your apples would all work together in a cider and give you a much more kind of consistent and standard flavor, instead of having to say, oh, we're going to have our cider apple trees over here and all that kind of thing. So the apples were, especially in early America, tended to be kind of this wild thing. There were circumstances where people had more, what would you call them, showy apple orchards. They were laid out very, very specifically, and they would have very specific varieties that they would have to spend a lot more money on to get these grafted apple trees and lay them out. So somebody like Thomas Jefferson, he'll have 2 different kinds of orchards. He'll have the farm orchard, haphazard, tall trees, all sorts of weird, just wild kind of apples growing, and then this very cultured apple orchard, all laid out, and a beautiful thing with very, very specific kinds of varieties. So I got a couple readings I thought would be kind of fun to talk about here. And it isn't just apples, of course. We've got cherries, pears specifically. There are also plum trees, and some varieties that we don't talk about anymore very much. Quinces were something that were kind of like that were growing in early America. Now I do have some right around the turn of the century, about 1800, talking about from some very specific apple varieties, and I'll talk about those in a bit. Let's see here. Where is... Yeah, peach trees are another one that grow in some of those places. Maybe we should do those slides.
I do think they'll give a nice sense of,
okay, good.
of that, the difference
I
between
didn't
the
look
trees.
at those as specifically, so we'll go through those and look at some of those kind of. Got some cider here, not real.
Oh. It's not 18th century
right.
cider.
In the 18th century, apple cider in America was probably the most popular drink. Beside, more popular than beer, more popular than wine, certainly. Apple cider is the thing. But apple cider in the time period wasn't just squeezed apples like we think of apple cider today, but it was hard apple cider. It was an alcoholic beverage. This is not hard apple cider. Here we go. Ooh, look at there. We can see this is probably 19th century.
Well, I think almost all the images are 19th century, but they do still convey a sense of
Right.
how the orchards would have been in the 18th century. So these are, much taller apples than we're certainly used to.
Right.
And you can see they're having a lot of fun with their harvesting.
Right, so big apple trees, tall apple trees. You got to work really hard at getting those apples out of them, and you can see they aren't laid out. They're just sort of, there. There's some,
Right, and not pruned the way that we would normally have a
certainly
pruned
not
orchard.
pruned. And I don't think they really worked hard at that.
No.
Of course, they didn't spray them or do anything like that. I think there was one reference where it talked about, it's like, well, you cut out some of the dead branches, and that's it. You're not really doing anything besides that. Here's another probably mid to late 19th century apple thing going on here. We see the livestock, running around in there, the geese, and the apple baskets, and people picking them out of the trees.
Oh, so this one is, these pictures were both taken in 1914, and both of the trees were at least 100 years old at the time. Because the book this is out of was actually someone doing research for the national parks, so that they were, and I believe that's where these trees were. And so you can see from the person standing next to the one tree, it looks like a dwarf apple tree in its shape and everything, a little bit.
But it's a big tree.
But it's much bigger.
Right. Now, on our property and on the property where I grew up, there were sort of kind of wild-like apple trees like this, pretty big apple trees, just kind of growing out and about on the farmstead, and they are nice and tall, just like that. So here is a couple of different advertisements. Here they're 1803, 1804, talking about pieces of property, and if you're going to buy a farm, and it talks about how it has 3 good dwelling houses and a log barn and 2 never failing springs. I like that. 2
Never failing.
A spring house and timber, and then 3 valuable apple orchards. And then, going ahead and talking about the acres of Timothy Meadow and all this. Somebody's advertising this very, very sizable farm. Of course, it says it's 462 acres, but with 3 different apple orchards. That's, basically probably 3 individual farms or 3 individual kind of settings. So that, because there are 3 dwelling houses and 3 apple orchards, but pretty. Each one of those, it's like if you don't have an apple orchard, well, you don't have a full functioning farm here.
Do you want to drop out to you for a second? I wanted
Sure.
to ask a question. So somebody was asking how many apple trees they would have on a farm, but a lot of times when I was looking, it was just mentioning it by acre.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It seems like you would definitely have a substantial, portion of your acreage. You would have this, a set aside part. It isn't like half a dozen trees. It might be, much more than that. Do we have that one picture of the
Oh, I don't think
landscape
I made it into
picture?
a slide.
Okay. Yeah. So we had one landscape picture. That's, you could see this acres and acres, and how big the plots for the orchards were. This particular image had both the very regular orchard for the kind of eating apples, and then a bigger kind of livestock and cider apples. So, and you could see on those bigger trees that they would have a lot of apples on them.
They would.
I mean,
they
they're
were
very prolific with the fruit that was coming off of them.
I also have, there's a super chat from Michael Miranda. Greetings. It is always wonderful to view your videos. Do you think you may be making a video about making ciders? And do you plan on adding any fruit trees to your homestead?
We do have some just kind of wild, perfect for the 18th century,
Yes.
apple trees, and these are apples from those trees that grow on our property. So we already kind of have that going on, and we do hopefully we'll do we do kind of in the early stages of planning a cider episode. So,
And Perry.
yeah, Perry. So this one, different tract of land, a slightly different spot here, 176 acres, pretty good size, never failing well, and a good young apple orchard. Now, apple orchards don't just, it takes a while for an apple orchard to come into fruition, right? So when they really start to happen. And when I was thinking about apples and apple orchards, one of the famous people for right around here, especially Fort Wayne, just right down the road, is Johnny Appleseed. And that whole concept about Johnny Appleseed, and there are a lot of stories about, he was a character and kind of a famous person, born in about 1774, I think, something like that, and dies in the 1840s. And he's famous for going around and planting apple trees. And he's taking along with him apple seeds. So he's not coming along with seedlings that are grafted. In fact, apparently, he had a particular religious ideas that made them not like the idea of grafted apple trees. So he's planting apple seeds. He carries around a big bag of them. Now, some of the stories, it just seems like he's a vagabond and he goes around and he plants apple trees. But part of what he's doing is he's buying pieces of property and planting apple orchards on them. And then when it's when the area gets more populated, he sells those pieces of property that already have the apple orchard going, instead of just saying, "Oh, this is the land that I'm, here's a bare piece of ground. Good luck, make a farm." It's like, no, I've already established an apple orchard here. Now, there was something really good. Oh yeah, starting in 1792. The Ohio Company of Associates made a deal with potential settlers. Anyone willing to form a permanent homestead on the wilderness beyond Ohio's first permanent settlement would be granted 100 acres of land. To prove their homesteads to be permanent, the settlers were required to plant 50 apple trees and 20 peach trees in 3 years. So that's part of, and it's kind of similar to what's happening in part of Kentucky in the late 18th century. This was the late 18th century, where they would say, oh, to prove, so if you want to claim this parcel of land, to prove that you're settling on it, you had to build some kind of building and you had to plant some corn. Well, here, this is a much more permanent thing. You plant corn and then, whatever. It's just one season's crop and it really doesn't matter. But they're saying, no, this is a much more permanent thing. We really want you to settle down into it. So we're going to have you plant and have apple trees. Very, very interesting thing. And that's, Johnny Appleseed has a whole bunch of kind of legends around him, but he certainly is one of those people that is important. And, of course, people are thinking, again, these apples, that they're apples for eating, when in reality, the apples are there for the livestock, or probably even more importantly, they're for making cider. Whew. Okay. Back to, let's see, what else we got here? Another land for sale. This is in Virginia. in the late 18th century. And, look at this. It's got timber, it's got houses, two double barns, and a large apple order of the choicest fruit, which seldom misses bearing. Because you want good apples.
Really, I thought that these real estate ads were like they made you want to buy that property.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
sounded wonderful.
I read about it and it sounds
Yep.
cool. Here's somebody who's selling all sorts of garden seeds imported, and then also a variety of fine English cherry trees, and a number of grafted apple trees, number of standard and trained currant trees, which they're really more of a bush, but gooseberry bushes, quince and lime trees, English pear, plum trees, and he's also got horseradish and sweet herbs and whatnot. And that's in Boston. There we go. So not every apple tree is a seeded apple, but there are grafted apple trees. And grafting of apple trees is happening all the way back into the 17th century. It's just not as popular.
Well, and I mean, I think that they were saying that even the Romans grafted.
Oh, yeah.
So it was a high skill that was used for expensive fruit gardens, and was
Right.
a practice that was used very far back. But it didn't really become very popular in America until I believe it was the 19th century where that became.
Right. And we were talking, thinking about that earlier. It's like one of the reasons why the settlement of America was always, at least in those first couple hundred years, was about sending things back to Europe. How can we make money by doing something here so that we can send that back to Europe where it's actually worth something? And there's no, if you can't grow something here that's, let's say, a fancy, just amazing tasting apple, right? If it's not something that you're able to ship back, then why grow it? It was like people in America didn't care whether they were actually consuming something good. They wanted to if they were going to make something good, it had to be something they could ship back to Europe and make money on it. And here it's like, it's so much easier to just have these other trees, and they're just like crumbing apples. Nobody would actually want to eat them, but our cows can eat them. Good enough.
But the cider probably tasted pretty good.
Yeah.
Now, where was the store you were telling me from with the guy who is?
Yeah, Dr. Alexander Hamilton, not the Alexander Hamilton you think of later on that has to do with banks and government and that kind of thing. But Dr. Alexander Hamilton, in the middle of the 18th century, he was a doctor who came from England, and he was, I think, based in Maryland. He was having some health problems, and he decided he would travel for the heck of it, right? And he travels up the east coast of, I'm trying to figure out how that would look to you guys on that.
Yes, that one.
He travels up the east coast, and he talks about his travels. And at one point, he is crossing a ferry on the river in Pennsylvania, and he stops at the ferryman's house to have food. It was like, that's kind of a standard sort of tavern or inn. The person who's going to take you across the river, they would, likely serve people food at times. He stops at this place, and he talks about the ferryman, the family, and they're eating food, and he's just astounded by their primitiveness. They take this fish, they cook it, and they basically put it in a bowl, and they just eat out of this common bowl. They don't have any utensils or anything. They just eat the scales, and he's talking about just like, and of course they offer him food, and he's just, no way, I'm not eating that. But yet they serve him their cider that they've made, and he says it's very good. So cider was important even, and here there's this person, he runs a ferry, they're eating whatever, but yet they make yummy cider. Mm-hmm. Peach trees. New Hampshire. Can you imagine peach trees growing in?
That seems a little chilly. Yes,
Yeah.
it does. They must have been hardy peaches.
Peach engrafted on plum succeeds excellently and lives longer than it would have done in its natural state. So yeah, the reason seems to be that peaches are tender and so yeah.
In one of the plans where they were talking about their fruit gardens, they were talking about planting the hardier trees around the outside
Right.
and the tender ones on the inside to help protect them. Because of course, just like our fruit trees, you get a hard frost at the wrong time and there
Yeah.
goes all the fruit for the year.
Well, and that is, I think, important too. Not only if you've got a very varied orchard with lots of, it's like this apple, that apple, whatever, and they're all just kind of whatever. They not only harvest at different times, but they also blossom at different times so that if you get a frost, it might not kill your entire crop, and so you still have some apples producing. Let's see. There's, now these seem, this
Yes,
is 1856.
this is late. And to me,
Right.
these look like they were probably much more cultivated, probably grafted on dwarf because they're so short.
Right.
But I also thought it was a lovely picture. It made a nice contrast to the height of the other trees.
Well, they certainly look like they're relaxing.
How many apples are actually getting picked here?
Yes. Now, when it comes to varieties, America did have a couple of specific apple varieties that were sort of renowned, and one of them was the Newton Pippin. What was the other one? The Baldwin, something like that.
I didn't run across the other one in my research.
Yes,
so
I think
don't
the
know.
other one is the Baldwin, and one's from Massachusetts. The other one's from New York. I think the Newton Pippin was from New York, and they were good enough, especially the Newton Pippin, that they were starting to be exported at times. I think Benjamin Franklin is the first one who's like, you know what, send me some of our apples, right? And he gets the apples sent over to Europe when he's there, and that starts a little bit of commerce in apples being sent back to England from the New World. So there was only just those kind of specific varieties that were specifically North American varieties that were developed. But somewhere I've got here a listing from the Encyclopedia of, where it's talking about some of these earlier varieties. Some of them we might still kind of remember, right? Plantations of the table fruit only. So this is for actually eating, not just for baking with or whatever. And I think this is 1803. So we have the Easter apple or Pasch apple, and then Saracen, White Winter Cavil, Gravestein, I think I've heard of those. Gravenstein, sorry. Streaked Rose Apple, Russian Ice Apple. That
sounds great.
Good. Russian Ice Apple. German Muscadel pear. So, this was the one that I think is important. Let me make sure that it is. I think it's an apple. There are pears and other ones mixed in here. The nutmeg apple, right, is a valuable apple of considerable size, more globular than oblong, yellowish green, and somewhat rough, but of a dusky red on the south side. Its flesh is tender, eats short. Not sure what that means. Contains a large portion of sweet vinous juice, having a fine aromatic taste. It becomes edible towards the end of October and may be preserved in its full flavor for a whole year. the tree attains a respectable size. There's trout apple, Lauderman cherry, old royal cherry, victorious rennet, lady's plum, so some of these are plums, winter queen pear, doctor's cherry, Duke of Orleans plum, Saint Germain pear, the Royal English apple. We have golden rennet. We have royal plum, and there's Newton Pippin, or the New York rennet, a noble American apple. And then it says there are other apples here that are specifically listed. The white Italian rosemary apple, punctured rennet, the great English rennet, and the spotted pippin, the noble pippin, the Norman apple. So there are a lot of different apples that are going on there. It seems like, we've probably seen references to when you get into the middle of the 19th century and the late 19th century, the apple varieties just explode. And there were literally, hundreds and hundreds of apple varieties. And it's interesting that it's kind of shrunk back down to these very, very specific commercially viable apples that we have today, where you go to the store and there might be 10 varieties, right? Which seems like a lot. Probably when I was a kid, you go to the store and there were 2. But
it's still lovely to know that there's
Right.
heritage farms that are preserving
Right.
the different varieties.
Right.
And
They just probably don't ship as well, or, they don't have a
might not
specific-
be as high a percentage of ones that look as pristine, ready to go to
exactly.
the store.
Yeah, because today, boy, if it had a spot on it,
Just one spot and it's out. Okay, do you want a break from apples to do
yes.
our supporters? And you want our snack?
Hold on. Let me. Every week we try to get to new, renewing YouTube members, Patreon, all those kind of folks. And there's a lot of YouTube member renewals. I didn't get them last week, so Macaroni Gluer Games, Kathy German, Kestrel 1027, Norman Yerby, Cable Tech Logan, Dirty Mick 2, Antics, David Collar, Daniel Burke, Neil Van Schalkwick, Jim, Jessica Marie, Christina Lynn, Ryan, Renee Shepard, Luke Berniking, Jessica Gasparini, Leviticus Prime, brand new Patreon people, The Ceaseless Pen, and Jan and Pius the 8th. We got a special food because today and tomorrow are Pearston days, and so they had this wood-fired pizza truck over there, and so we have wood-fired pizza. You can see the wood-fired pizza truck. We thought that was funny that people are still using the earthen oven design, even though it's made with bricks, and sometimes we've made pizzas in an earthen oven.
We have. The technique just seems so familiar to me. So we've got our guest pizza today.
Yeah.
And it truly tastes delicious.
Yeah, it tastes delicious, and they cook like instantly.
Yes, they do.
It's like, boop, oh, your pizza's done. That's my kind of pizza. Of course, now if you go back and you do the pizza episode that we did, I don't know, was it early last year?
I think it was last year sometime
Right.
at least. Mm-hmm.
That was a really
Really good pizza, really.
Anyway, yeah, the the apple varieties were from the Domestic Encyclopedia, 1803, printed in Philadelphia. So they were, your concepts of what you might find in, early 19th century America. Well, that's a lot of different kinds of apples.
It was. And a lot of times when someone was bringing up one of those older varieties and I didn't recognize the name, they'd say, and we recognize it as important now because it was an ancestor to the Red Delicious, or a name that Yafuji, or something. I'm like, yeah, I know that one. See it every time I go to the grocery store. So.
Really interesting book that a lot of the information came out of, done by the National Park Service. Fruitful Legacy, the historical context of orchards in the United States. A lot of really good information about what was going on there in the 18th century. I think kind of, wrapping your head around the idea that they're using orchards in a completely different way than we would use them today is kind of fun. That it was like, apples, that's a really important animal food. It's really important for cider because, we want to drink something. Cider probably more important than water was for the colonists because it's like, boy, that's what they want. There's a Benjamin Franklin saying. He says, "Give me yesterday's bread, today's flesh, and last year's cider." So their cider is one of those. It's one of the ways you. Not only is it something you want to drink, but it's a way to use that orchard in a functional way the entire year. So your orchard, even though you might only have edible apples out of it for 6 or 8 weeks, your cider is going to be good for the entire year.
Okay, got a couple super chats. So one of them is from Max Sarkle. Do you have enough pizza to share with the whole group, Mr. Townsend?
Yeah, some more over there.
And then another one from Max Sarkle. Love those old names of old apple varieties. I had a Duchess of Oldenburg for many years until it gave up the ghost. Huge apple for eating and saucing.
Yeah. You don't hear much about applesauce. There was one reference in one of the encyclopedias where, and the encyclopedias tend to be a little bit more kind of homey and personal sometimes. And the writer of the article was talking about recovering this apple tree. It's like, I had this apple tree and it was huge and 30 years old, but it never produced any apples. And he talks about a process about getting it to bear fruit. Of course, I don't know how that actually worked. He scaled the bark and then he built a little moat around it and filled it up with compost. And then the next year it had a gazillion apples on it. So much it was breaking the branches off. And sounds like a story to me.
Sometimes you wonder, how accurate is this description? Okay, so here is a super chat from Mr. J. Willis 1. The research is great. I am learning much and having fun.
Very good.
Excellent. And then this is from Macaroni Gluer Games. Were pecan orchards common in the 18th century? And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I had not run across any research, but I did a quick look, and apparently I did not know pecans were the native nut to the North America, but it looks like they did start growing them in the late 17th century, or the late 1700s, I'm sorry. And then by 1802, the French were exporting pecans to the West Indies. So they did at least have orchards by that point.
Right.
And apparently they caught on, which I'm glad to hear, because pecans are delicious. So I'm glad they had good taste.
Yeah, there are some of these references in the orchards to not just fruits, but there are some nut references, specifically, like walnuts and some
Chestnuts, almonds.
Yeah. And almonds, you say? Okay.
Yeah.
Almonds, right. So not just apples, pears, whatever. Let's see. We got supporters. We're eating pizza, and before we get too far into it, we want to talk a little bit. We might come back to apples, but I've covered most of what I wanted to say. So many people are familiar with the Mississinewa 1812 event that happens about an hour away from here to the south, down by Marion, Indiana. And they ran into a problem with the site, which is a state site, that made it so that they just basically couldn't do the event anymore at that site. And so they canceled the event this year. And a new announcement in the last couple of days was that they purchased new ground right in that area so that they'll have a private site to do the event. So Mississinewa is happening again, not this year, but it will start to happen next year. And with a site that's under their control, they'll probably be able to do some really neat things. Maybe they'll have like real bathrooms or something. Who knows?
We're pie in the sky.
Yeah,
That's what
we're putting in our 2 cents about that. But we're really excited about Mississinewa 1812 happening again. It is probably the premier 1812 event that's happening in the United States. So it'll be great to have that happen again. Excited by that. Since we're not going to Mississinewa this year, we are going back to the Feast of the Hunter's Moon, Fort Ouiatenon in West Lafayette, which usually happens a week or two earlier than that, so in October. So we do plan on going to that event. And if you are interested in historical reenactment events, I would suggest checking out Reenacting Schedule.
Yes.
Reenactingschedule.org. Lauren put a link down in the chat so you can check that out, see if there are any historic events that are happening in your area, so that you can have fun and go see people doing fun stuff, fun historical stuff. What else do we have? Apple orchards. I do have a fun selection of mugs we're showing off with our apples today. You've probably seen our Nutmeg Tavern mugs. This is a needs more nutmeg mug. We do also have just straight historical mugs in different sizes and shapes. The fun pieces from salt glaze pieces from Conner Prairie, our local Potter does the blackjack mugs. We get pewter mugs, and I don't know what do we call this one?
Stoneware tankard.
Yeah, stoneware tankard. Right. All the great stuff that you can find on our website is, boy, if you search mug on our website, you're going to get a lot of neat choices. So make sure to check those out. A collection of the best sorts of graft and inoculated English fruit trees. And they put in here English limes and English elms, which I thought was kind of odd when it's like, I don't think I put a lime tree, which is a lime tree, I don't remember exactly what that is. It's like, why they call those a fruit tree? I do not know. Did we talk about the peach tree grafted on the plum tree?
Yes, we did.
There we go. And there's our apple orchards for sale. Here's Peter Kalm. And Peter Kalm is traveling in 1750. And he is going up the East Coast. He ends up going to Canada. And here he's talking about being in around the Albany, New York area. So there's several sorts of apple trees grow very well here and bear as fine a fruit as in any other part of North America. Each farm has a larger orchard. They have some apples here which are very large and very palatable. they're sent to New York and other places as a rarity. They make excellent cider in the autumn and in the country around Albany. All kinds of cherry trees which have been planted here succeed very well. Pear trees do not succeed here. This was complained of in many other parts of North America, but I fear that they do not take sufficient care in their management and planting of them, for I have seen fine pears in several parts of North America. And he even goes on to talk about peach trees, often planted here, but don't succeed well, and it's attributed to a worm that lives in the ground and eats through the roots.
Oh.
Yes. Now, there was a really interesting part of the bark-covered house. And in the bark-covered house, they are setting up a homestead in Pioneer, Michigan, right up by Detroit. And in the they build their first very, very primitive cabin, and then they build their second house. And he says, Father said he would get us some apple trees. He had heard there was a small nursery below Dearbornville. One morning he and I started for the village. From there we went to Mr. McVeigh's about 2 miles east, near the Rouge, I think it's River Rouge. Of him, Father bought 13 apple trees, did them up in 2 bundles, his large, mine small. We took them on our shoulders and started home through the woods, thus saving 2 miles travel. And we planted the apple trees on the west end of the little ridge. They are now old trees, so he's probably doing this in somewhere around 1830 or so. And the memoir here was written in the 1870s or 80s, so 40 or 50 years later. They're now old trees. I passed them the other day and thought of the time we set them. Now some of them look as if they're dying with old age. I counted and found some of them were gone. I thought there was no one but me who could tell how and when those trees were planted, and as they are nearly 40 years old. So there we go. And a different section in Peter Kalm where he talks about kind of the connection between the orchards and gardens. Farms were commonly built close to the river on the hills. Each house has a little kitchen garden and a still lesser orchard. Some farms, however, had large gardens. The kitchen gardens afford several kinds of gourds, watermelons, and kidney beans. The orchards are full of apple trees. This year, the trees had few or no apples on account of the frosty nights, which had happened in May. And Peter Kalm, very interesting because he really goes into detail. Sometimes it's the detail that you don't care about, and other times detail is very, very interesting. So, I mean, he doesn't know what,
He
what
just
we
went
care
into
about.
a lot of detail,
Right.
and so some of it's perfect.
Right. So
And
sometimes.
some of it's perfect
really
for someone
helpful,
else other than us. There were a couple different questions. So Mike gifted some memberships, some Townsends memberships to people.
Thank you.
And also sent in a member chat. Love your mugs. They're so nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad you like them. And then Speed and Style Tony sent in a super chat. When did cider go from spirits to juice?
That's probably something that's happening specifically in that 19th century time period and early 20th century where you get prohibition. Same thing's happening with, it's like, why do we have Welch's grape juice? And it was specifically part of that temperance movement where it's like before that, you can't, it's like, you make grape juice, it's going to turn into wine. And the same thing is happening with something like cider. You make cider, today's cider, and we have to have to pasteurize it and be careful that it doesn't start to go bad, right? But that's all they did in the 18th century. Now, some of the cider recipes are, well, you just squeeze this stuff and you put it aside and it takes off and does its own thing. Other times, you specifically set yeast to it and get it to work so that you know it's got a good functional yeast instead of just, well, just letting it go. But generally, apple cider will take off on its own and turn into some kind of fun alcoholic beverage if you just kind of let it set. Except, that's unpasteurized apple cider.
If you make your own, which we did
Right.
one time. And
Exactly.
I don't think it was more than a day.
Right.
And we're like, we got to get this somewhere cooler than
Right.
it is and
Yeah.
get it and start pasteurizing some of it because it started to ferment very, very quickly. And still tasted pretty good, but it did not.
3 or 4 days later, it was really good.
So in the Johnny Appleseed article, it does talk about during Prohibition, the FBI agents were chopping down some of those trees that were specifically for the apple cider orchards. Very sad. Okay, and then I was trying to remember what the other question that was related to that was. Oh, this is a different question. Somebody was wondering about the pear cultivation in the time period. And I think in Fruitful Legacy, there's a specific section and it's talking about what kinds of pears. And I think it's a French strain that they
Really?
used primarily. And that's where most of the American ones kind of branched off from.
Well, guys.
Right. I think it was closer to the end of that first chapter, but I'm not 100% sure.
It's very detailed. So there's a section here about unlike seedling pears, however, pear varieties did not become a feature in farm orchards, and it did say a thing here that they were acquiring the choice pears from France for their fruit gardens, and Thomas Jefferson doing his thing, and specifically being a customer of that. There was a particular nursery here in North America that was kind of the forefront of these grafted trees.
Was it the Prince
Yeah,
Nursery?
it's called Prince Nursery.
And they started pretty early on.
Yeah,
It was before 1770,
right.
I think. And it was referenced multiple different times, and they had a couple different apple varieties that were named that they specifically cultivated there, and one of them was the Prince apple.
Yeah, Robert Prince, a Long Island landowner associated with the French Huguenots, established a commercial nursery in Flushing in 1730.
Yes.
So
I thought it was early. Yep.
That's pretty darn early for working hard on those specialty, fruit trees. So.
Okay, and somebody was wondering that they were guessing crab apples were more common back then.
So if you read in Peter Kalm, and if you just do a word search on apples, probably a third or half of the references are specifically for crab apples. And he talks a lot about crab apples in that. So yes. Now, I don't know a lot about what the real differences are on crab apples and what's going on with that. We didn't
Spend
it
very much.
a ton of time on that one.
So somebody was wondering what percentage of apples were being grown for cider, and someone else in the chat guessed that it was probably close to 100%. If you weren't going to feed them to your livestock, a little bit of baking and
the livestock and cider apples are kind of half and half, right? So you could use them all for cider, or you might just let the windfall be for the livestock, and then the best ones you would use for cider or whatever. So, but probably the vast majority could have been used for cider specifically. They seem to be much less they didn't have specifically cider apples, right? It's like any apple's going to work for that, and some of those, depending on your needs, you might feed more of them to your livestock or use them for cider, and then you have these special table apples.
And then someone was wondering about the quinces and the medlars and when those were going out of fashion. And it really seemed like they tapered off right around 1800.
Yeah, the quinces are mentioned plenty of times in here, but they did seem to have disease problems and popularity issues, probably because, again, they're not commercially viable because you can't ship them. They're much more delicate fruit. Medlars are something that I did not see much in here. I think that's an European thing, and it's even earlier. But I don't know if there's much medlar things going on in North America.
Okay, I think we're all caught up on our questions and whatnot.
Yeah, was there one other Franklin quote?
Oh, it's in the book. The book's right there down on the thing, and we'll open up to it. It's on the right side of that page, the other page. Yes, that page in the middle.
Oh, yes. Okay, you tell me what this means. Never praise your cider or your horse. I mean,
everything else is fair game, just not the cider or the
boastful. Horse. I don't know. There's Benjamin Franklin talking about cider. Last week's episode, what did I just do? What episode?
What did you just do? Was it the cornbread?
No, it wasn't cornbread.
Hold on.
It was something. It's the
it was the stew.
Worcester stew.
Yes.
Yeah. That was really good. And whenever I see that green pea stuff, and I was like, oh, but it was really good this time. The next episode coming up is oysters. Ryan said that he thought one of the dishes that was done was the best thing that's been done in the German kitchen.
Well, why didn't he bring in the extras so we could taste it? I got to have the curry when it was done.
I don't know, like next day's oyster.
Maybe there more than 10
left. It's like,
not.
Give me yesterday's bread, today's oyster, and then last year's cider. It probably is a reason for that. So make sure to mark your calendar on Sunday for the brand new episode on oysters, and it should be super duper good. I've already seen it, so sorry guys, you're gonna have to live without that. Special thank you to, again, wonderful supporters, Patreon, YouTube members, Townsends Plus. That support is very, very important for what we do here, and it's one of the reasons why I'm here every week on the live stream, is because you guys help make this happen. Special thank you also to the folks that are always, in the comments and being kind to us there and sharing our videos specifically. Very, very important. So thank you so much. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Ivy. I hope you have a super tremendous weekend, and thanks for watching.